I learned early how to be unremarkable, how to walk fast without looking rushed, how to keep my eyes moving without letting them settle, how to exist in a city that doesn't care if you disappear, as long as you don't cause problems while you do. That's how you survive where I come from. By day, I worked the kind of jobs people forget as soon as they look past you. By night, I learned which streets forgave mistakes and which didn't. I knew the rhythm of the city the way other people knew prayer. When to speak, when to wait, when to leave before staying cost too much. The building where I worked wasn't mine, but it shaped my days. Polished stone floors. Quiet elevators. Offices that smelled like money and restraint. The people who belonged there never hurried. The people who didn't, people like me, learned to move efficiently and keep our heads down. Marco Santori didn't need to announce himself. You felt him in the pauses. In the way conversations adjusted without instruction. In the way security looked past some people and through others. I never spoke to him. I never needed to. He existed in the background of my life like weather. Predictable, distant, powerful. I thought that distance meant safety. The night everything changed didn't feel dramatic at first. No warning. No sense of fate closing in. Just tired legs, a familiar route, and the quiet confidence that if I kept moving, I'd be fine. Always was. I wasn't. By morning, pain had a voice. Not loud, just persistent. The kind you negotiate with because you don't have time to stop. Covered what I could. Hid what I couldn't. Told myself the same lie I'd always told. This was temporary, and I could handle it alone. I almost succeeded. Until I crossed a room where power lived quietly, and someone finally looked at me long enough to notice what I'd been trying not to see myself. Marco Santori didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a phone. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply leaned close enough that the rest of the world fell away and asked, softly, "Who hurt you?" I didn't know it yet, but that question was already moving through the city. And by morning, nothing would sound the same again. Survival, for me, had never looked like triumph. Looked like routine. It looked like waking up before my alarm because anxiety didn't respect schedules, like choosing buses over cabs and silence over honesty. It meant counting steps, counting cash, counting how many times I could say, "I'm fine," before someone stopped believing me. I lived in a narrow apartment above a laundromat that never really slept. The machines hummed through the night, a low mechanical heartbeat that reminded me I wasn't alone, even when I felt like it. I shared the space with a second-hand couch, a mattress on the floor, and a stack of envelopes I didn't open anymore because the numbers inside never changed in my favor. Work was where I disappeared best. Places where people needed things done but didn't need to know who did them. I was reliable, quiet, rest. The kind of person managers trusted because I didn't ask for more than I was given. The kind of person they forgot the moment I stepped out of view. I'd learned restraint early. Don't react too quickly. Don't linger too long. Don't draw lines you can't defend. When men raised their voices on the street, I crossed early. When arguments bloomed on subway platforms, I stepped back. Pride was a luxury. Safety was not. There were nights I felt the weight of it more than others. Walking home with my keys threaded between my fingers. Checking reflections in darkened windows. Adjusting my pace to match shadows. Never letting myself be the only person on a block if I could help it. People like to say the city was alive. To me it was alert, always watching, always waiting. I told myself endurance was strength. That if I could keep moving, keep working, keep my head down, the worst things would pass me by. That if I didn't ask for help, I wouldn't owe anyone anything. Independence, I decided, meant not being seen. Most days that belief held. On good mornings, I let myself imagine a different life. One where my shoulders weren't always tight, where the future didn't feel like a narrow hallway with no doors. On bad ones, I focused on the next hour. The next shift. The next bill. I didn't dream big anymore. I dreamed small and precise. Paid off balance. A week without overtime. A night where I could walk home without calculating risk. What I didn't understand then was that endurance has a cost. That surviving quietly doesn't mean surviving untouched. And that sometimes, The very restraint you rely on is what allows harm to reach you without resistance. Kept going anyway. Because that's what I'd always done. And because stopping, really stopping, felt more dangerous than anything waiting for me outside. The city remembered everything, even when people pretended it didn't. Every block carried a history you learned to read if you stayed long enough. Who owned the corner, which storefronts closed too early, which streets emptied faster than they should. The rules weren't posted anywhere. They lived in pauses, in glances exchanged and quickly withdrawn, in the way conversations softened when certain cars rolled past. I'd learned them the same way everyone else did, by watching, by listening, by making mistakes small enough to survive. Some streets welcomed noise. Laughter spilled out of bars, music bled through open windows, arguments burned hot and loud before cooling just as quickly. Other streets demanded quiet. You felt it the moment you stepped onto them, the air tightening, your shoulders instinctively drawing inward. On those blocks people walked with purpose. Heads down, hands visible, no sudden movements. Territory wasn't marked by signs. It was marked by absence. No loitering. No graffiti layered over old tags. No broken glass left overnight. When something bad happened there, it didn't repeat. When something worse happened, no one talked about it at all. I knew which routes to take home depending on the hour. Which corners were safe until midnight and which turned unpredictable after dark. I knew which bodegas would let you wait inside if something felt off, and which ones locked their doors early and pretended not to see you. The city rewarded awareness, punished assumption. I passed men every day who looked like they belonged everywhere. Tailored coats, easy confidence, the kind of calm that came from never having to second-guess your right to occupy space. I passed others who moved like they were borrowing time, always halfway prepared to run. You could tell who had protection and who only had luck. I belonged to neither group. I lived in the narrow margin between them. There were names people didn't say out loud. Not because they were secret, but because saying them felt like an invitation. Influence didn't announce itself. It settled. It lingered. It shaped neighborhoods the way gravity shapes water. Quietly, inevitably. You learned to respect that pull. When something went wrong on a street that remembered, it didn't stay wrong for long. Balance was restored one way or another. When something went wrong on a street no one claimed, it echoed. Repeated. Spread. That was the difference. I'd always believed that if I followed the rules, kept my head down, respected boundaries, stayed alert, I'd be fine. That the city, harsh as it was, respected effort. But the city doesn't care about effort. Cares about lines. And the night I crossed one without realizing it, the street didn't forget. It remembered me. And it remembered exactly where I belonged, or didn't. The night it happened didn't feel different at first. That was the cruelest part. Same bus ride home, same half-lit sidewalks, same rhythm of footsteps that blended into the city's low hum. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I might stop for coffee even though it was late. A small reward for getting through another day without breaking. Routine is a kind of armor. You trust it because it's held before. I took my usual route, hands tucked into my jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. The streetlights flickered the way they always did, casting everything in uneven gold. Few cars passed. Someone laughed somewhere behind me. The city was awake but not paying attention. That should have warned me. I noticed the quiet too late. Not silence, just absence. The kind where sound doesn't echo because there's nothing to catch it. I slowed without meaning to, every instinct tugging at me at once. Don't panic. Don't run. Just keep moving. Then a voice cut through the space. Casual. Almost friendly. Stop. That was my mistake. The details blur after that, like my mind decided to protect itself by smudging the edges. I remember being surrounded. I remember hands too close, blocking paths I hadn't realized were closing. I remember the sharp realization that this wasn't random, that something about me had been noticed. Fear is strange. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it goes very still. I did what I always did. Complied. I spoke carefully. I tried to disappear. But the situation had already shifted into something else, something heavier than inconvenience or bad luck. Words were exchanged that didn't belong to me. Names I didn't recognize but understood the weight of. A boundary I hadn't known I was standing near was suddenly very real. Time fractured. Moments stretched, then snapped back into place out of order. I remember the ground, cold and unforgiving. I remember thinking about my keys, still clenched uselessly in my fist. I remember the sound of footsteps retreating, unhurried, as if nothing important had happened. When it was over, the street looked the same. That felt wrong too. I stayed there longer than I should have, sitting with my back against a brick wall, forcing my breathing to slow. Pain arrived in waves, insistent but distant, like it belonged to someone else. Shock does that. It delays reality just long enough to keep you moving. Eventually I stood. I checked myself the way you do after a fall, cataloging what worked and what didn't. My phone was gone. My bag too. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with what was missing. I walked home because I didn't know what else to do. By the time I reached my building, the night had already decided it would keep my secret. Windows were dark. Doors stayed closed. The city went on breathing, indifferent. Routine was broken. And I knew, with a clarity that settled deep in my bones, that nothing about my life would feel automatic again. Morning came without mercy. Light slipped through the blinds and landed directly on my face, sharp and invasive, like it had a point to prove. I lay still, letting the weight of my body register one piece at a time. My ribs ached when I breathed too deeply. My jaw protested when I swallowed. Every small movement carried a consequence. I waited until the pain settled into something manageable before sitting up. The room looked the same as it always had. Unmade bed, chair with yesterday's clothes draped over it, the faint smell of detergent drifting up from the laundromat below. Normal. That was important. If the room could pretend nothing had changed, so could I. The mirror didn't share that commitment. I stared at my reflection longer than I meant to, cataloging damage with the same detached focus I used for bills and schedules. Swelling. Discoloration. A cut that would draw questions if I let it. I turned my face slightly, testing angles, learning what the light revealed and what it forgave. Concealment became strategy. Cold water helped. Makeup helped more. I worked carefully, patiently, layering until my face resembled a version of myself that could pass inspection. Not untouched, just unremarkable. I chose clothes that covered everything worth hiding, fabrics thick enough to blur outlines, sleeves long enough to keep curiosity at bay. Pain followed me as I moved, a low, constant reminder that endurance wasn't the same as healing. I ignored it the way I always did. Pain was negotiable. Missing work wasn't. Coffee tasted like metal, but it was hot and that mattered. I drank it standing by the window, watching the street wake up. Delivery trucks, early commuters, people stepping into their lives without hesitation. I envied that ease more than anything. There was a moment, small, dangerous, when I considered staying home, letting myself rest, letting someone else handle things for once. The thought passed quickly. Rent didn't pause. Neither did the city. Neither did whatever had decided I was worth noticing. I checked my pockets out of habit, felt the absence immediately. No phone, no bag. The loss settled in my chest heavier than the bruises. Being unreachable felt like standing on a ledge without realizing how high it was. I left anyway. Each step outside required intention. I moved slower, more aware of my body and space, more conscious of eyes that might linger too long. I kept my gaze forward, my posture composed, my expression neutral. Determination, I'd learned, didn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looked like refusal to stop. By the time I reached work, my breathing had evened out. The city hadn't changed overnight. That was almost comforting. I told myself the hardest part was over. That I'd survived the night, and survival was what I was good at. What I didn't know yet was that concealment has a shelf life. And that determination, once noticed, has a way of attracting attention I was no longer prepared to avoid. I was halfway through my shift when I felt it. That subtle shift in a room that had nothing to do with sound. The kind that makes your spine straighten before your mind catches up. I kept my focus where it belonged, hands busy, movements measured, pretending not to notice what my instincts already had. Marco Santori didn't announce himself. He never needed to. His presence arrived before he did, carried by the way conversations thinned out and the air seemed to recalibrate. People adjusted without realizing they were doing it. Voices lowering, steps redirecting, attention narrowing. I had seen him before, of course. Everyone had. But always from a distance, always as part of the background architecture of power. He moved through spaces like he owned the time inside them, not just the walls. Tailored suit. Dark hair threaded with just enough silver to suggest experience rather than age. His expression rarely shifted, but when it did, it was deliberate. Kept my head down. That had always worked. This time it didn't. I felt his gaze before I saw him. Not the casual glance of a passerby, but something steadier, more precise. Like he was assembling information instead of making assumptions. I resisted the urge to tense, reminding myself that attention wasn't accusation. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He simply watched. I finished what I was doing and moved on, careful not to favor one side too obviously. Pain flared anyway, sharp enough to make my breath hitch for just a fraction of a second. Caught it. Controlled it. But the damage was done. Marco noticed. He noticed the way my pace slowed when I turned. The way my shoulders stayed unnaturally still. The way my eyes tracked exits before people. He noticed what I avoided and what I endured. And most importantly, he noticed the effort it took for me to pretend everything was normal. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud. Come here. 2 words. Unavoidable. I turned, every internal alarm chiming at once. Up close, his eyes were darker than I expected. Not cold but unreadable. They moved over me with clinical patience, not curiosity. Assessment, not judgment. You're hurt, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm fine. The reflex came easily. Too easily. He didn't respond right away. Just held my gaze, letting the lie exist between us long enough to expose itself. Then he tilted his head slightly, as if reconsidering a detail. Look at me, he said. I did. The silence stretched. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady but loud in my ears. He stepped closer, not invading, just near enough to remove distance as an option. His attention sharpened, tracing what makeup softened and clothing concealed. People like Marco Santori didn't miss patterns. They noticed deviations. Finally he spoke again. Softer this time. Controlled. This didn't happen by accident. Something in my chest shifted. Not fear, recognition. The moment when endurance is seen not as strength, but as evidence. He straightened, already turning away, as if the decision had been made without my input. Stay where you are, he said over his shoulder. I watched him walk off, surrounded immediately by quiet movement and lowered voices. The room adjusted around him like it always did. Only now, I realized he wasn't adjusting to the room. He was adjusting the city. And somehow, without asking permission, I had become part of what he was watching. He waited until we were alone. Not truly alone. Places like this never were. But removed enough that the world narrowed to a desk, a chair, and the space between us. Marco Santori stood with his back to the window. The city stretched out behind him like something he'd already solved. I remained where he'd told me to stand. Hands loosely folded, posture careful. Authority didn't rush. It didn't need to. You don't owe me an explanation, he said at last. His voice was even unremarkable in tone, which somehow made it heavier. But you're going to give me one. I swallowed. Lies lined up automatically, neat and practiced. Fall. An accident. Bad luck. The same stories people accepted because they were convenient for everyone involved. He watched me consider them. Before you answer, he continued. Understand this, I already know what didn't happen. The silence pressed in. I felt exposed in a way clothing and composure couldn't fix. This wasn't interrogation. It was precision. He wasn't trying to trap me. He was removing exits. I don't want trouble, I said finally. Truth shaped small. I just want to do my job. That's not an answer, Marco replied. Not unkindly. Not impatiently. Just factual. He stepped closer, enough that I could see the faint scar near his temple, the subtle lines at the corners of his eyes. Evidence of a life where consequence had been a constant companion. He studied my face again, this time without restraint. People who fall don't protect one side of their body for days afterward, he said. They don't scan rooms. They don't flinch when someone moves too fast. My hands tightened before I could stop them. Someone hurt you, he said. Still calm. Still controlled. And they thought they could. The words landed differently than I expected. Not accusatory. Not possessive. Declarative. As if the act itself had disrupted something larger than me. I hesitated, caught between instinct and exhaustion. Endurance had taught me to absorb, not to name. To keep harm private. To survive quietly. Marco waited. That more than anything broke me. On my way home, I said. My voice stayed steady, even as something in me loosened. It wasn't random. His jaw tightened just slightly. Where? Told him. When? Answered. He nodded once, filing the information away with care that suggested it would be used efficiently. He didn't ask how bad it was. He didn't ask why I hadn't gone to the police. He already knew the answers to those questions, or understood why they didn't matter. Then he asked the one thing that changed everything. Who did this to you? The question wasn't loud. It didn't threaten. It didn't promise. Carried certainty. I realized then that telling the truth wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledging that something had crossed a line, and that Marco Santori was the kind of man who redrew lines with permanence. Exhaled. And I answered. Marco didn't react the way I expected. There was no flash of anger, no raised voice, no dramatic vow. He absorbed my answer the way stone absorbs heat. Slowly, completely, without cracking. He turned away from me and reached for his phone. Call. No preamble. 3 men, he said quietly. I want names before sunset. I want to know who they answer to, who they owe, and who thinks they protect them. Yes. Quietly. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket as if he'd just checked the weather. The room felt different now. Tighter. Not with fear but with purpose. You did the right thing, he said, not looking at me. By telling me. I wasn't sure that was true yet. Power had momentum. Once it moved, it didn't stop where you hoped it would. Marco crossed to the window, gazing down at the street far below. From up here the city looked orderly. Lines of traffic. Pedestrians moving with intent. No sign of the undercurrents shifting beneath it all. They thought you were alone, he continued. That's why they did it. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what there was to say. He turned back to me then, studying my face one last time. Not for damage this time, but for resolve. You're not, he said simply. Another phone buzzed. He didn't answer it immediately. He waited, letting the caller sit with the uncertainty. When he did pick up, his voice was low enough that I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the effect. Short replies. Affirmations. Decisions being made without debate. When the call ended, Marco exhaled slowly, as if completing a calculation. By morning, he said, this will be finished. The certainty in his voice was absolute. Not a threat. Timetable. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease settle into my chest. I'd wanted acknowledgement. 50. What I'd triggered was something much larger than either. You can go home, he added. You'll be driven. I can. This isn't a discussion, he said gently. Not unkind. Just final. He nodded. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of movement in the hallway, men appearing where there had been none before. Phones in hands. Murmured conversations. A machine coming online. No one looked at me directly. But I felt it then, the shift. The way space rearranged itself around a decision that had already been made. I walked out into the corridor with careful steps, aware that the city I'd navigated by instinct for years was changing its rules. Not loudly, efficiently, and all because someone had finally asked a question and meant it. The city didn't react the way people think it does when something shifts. There were no sirens cutting through the dark, no sudden chaos spilling into the streets. Night settled in the same way it always had, lights flickering on in apartment windows, bars filling, trains rumbling beneath the ground. That was how I knew something was happening. The driver took routes I didn't recognize, smooth and deliberate, avoiding certain blocks without explanation. He didn't speak and I didn't ask. The car felt insulated from the rest of the world, like it was moving through a layer beneath the city everyone else thought they knew. At home I couldn't sleep. I lay on my bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling while time stretched thin. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of traffic, a door closing somewhere down the hall, the distant wail of laughter that ended too abruptly. I wondered where the men who had hurt me were. If they were laughing too. If they believed the night would end the way all others had. Phones rang across the city that night. Doors opened quietly. Meetings happened in back rooms and parked cars with engines still warm. People who hadn't spoken in years found reasons to reconnect. Favors were remembered. Debts resurfaced. I wasn't there to see any of it. That was the point. Power doesn't perform for witnesses. It works best when no one can point to a single moment and say, "This is when it happened." Sometime after midnight my phone buzzed. A new one, already loaded with a single contact. No message. Just a missed call that told me enough. Things were still moving. I imagined men retracing their steps, realizing too late that they'd crossed into a space that didn't tolerate mistakes. I imagined confidence draining from rooms as certainty replaced it. Not fear yet. Understanding. The hours crept toward morning. I made tea I didn't drink. Sat by the window and watched headlights pass, each one carrying someone who believed the rules were still the same. Somewhere out there they weren't. By 3 a.m. the city felt quieter. Not asleep held. Like breath drawn in and not yet released. I understood then that this wasn't about vengeance. It was about correction. About reminding the city where lines were drawn and what happened when they were ignored. When dawn finally approached, the sky lightened without ceremony. No announcements, no headlines. Just the sense that something had concluded. Whatever had begun with a question had reached its answer. And I was still here. That realization sat heavy in my chest. Not triumph, not relief. Just awareness. The understanding that survival had taken on a new shape. By the time the sun cleared the buildings, the city moved again. But it moved differently. And so did I. Morning arrived with a restraint that felt intentional. The sun rose between buildings without glare. Light diffused by cloud cover like the city didn't want to draw attention to itself. Traffic resumed its usual rhythm, but something underneath it had shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible unless you knew how to listen. I stepped outside and felt it immediately. People moved with a little more caution. Conversations cut off sooner. Phones were checked, then pocketed, then checked again. Men who usually occupied corners with careless confidence stood farther back, eyes tracking more than they spoke. Storefronts opened on time but without music. Without flourish. The city wasn't afraid. It was aware. I walked the same streets I always had, but they didn't feel the same beneath my feet. Places that once carried noise now held silence like a warning. The alley I avoided instinctively yesterday was empty. Too empty. Cleaned. Corrected. No one said anything to me. No one needed to. By mid-morning, the rumors had already begun moving. Not loud enough to be repeated, but fast enough to be known. Crew pulled off a block. A debt called in early. A man who usually answered his phone didn't anymore. Another who did answered with a different tone. The city had recalibrated. At work, eyes slid away from mine with something like respect or caution. It was hard to tell which. No one asked questions. They didn't ask how I was feeling or if I needed time. That wasn't how things worked here. Concern took other forms. Protection didn't announce itself either. I caught my reflection in a window as I passed. Still bruised, still tired, still unmistakably myself. But something in my posture had changed. I wasn't lighter. I wasn't stronger. I was accounted for. Marco Santori didn't call. He didn't need to. His presence lingered in the order restored, in the way the city moved carefully around the spaces it had learned not to test. Power, once activated, didn't hover. It settled back into place and waited. I understood then what the question had really done. It hadn't been about me. It had been about reminding the city that harm had consequences, even when inflicted on someone who endured quietly. That lines existed for a reason. That silence, when it came, meant understanding, not ignorance. By noon, the city was loud again. Traffic honked. Music spilled out of open doors. Life continued, convincing and complete. But beneath it all was a new awareness. The city remembered. And this time it remembered me.